Welcome back to RCR Talk. You are here with Marie, and joining me now is Jill Ovens, the co-leader and National Secretary of the Women's Rights Party New Zealand. She's been a prominent advocate for women's and girls' sex-based rights and has a long history of activism in labour, education and women's issues. Jill leads the party's efforts to raise awareness of legal and social challenges affecting women, including hosting international speakers such Helen Joyce, which we're going to get into today, to discuss the impact of gender ideology onto women's rights. Jill, it's an absolute joy to have you back with RCR. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm good, despite the bit of power cuts. I'm on my phone.
Yes, I know. Hey, but this is RCR. We're going to keep going. Now, there's a lot that has been going on in the space since we last spoke. But the one most recently I saw a press release from you is around the recent Law Commission review recommendations, including gender identity and sex characteristics in the Human Rights Act and making some language gender neutral. Now, firstly, I thought we were done with this and had a coalition part that was going to deal to it. What concerns do you have about the proposed changes, particularly around protecting women's single-sex spaces and protecting women in sport?
Yes, well, those are two of the important ones, and single-sex schools are also in the target. But the whole thing, not only do they want to put gender identity and the included gender expression in the definition, but they also basically want to run roughshod over all the sex-based exceptions that are in the Human Rights Act. And the funny thing is, while they can define gender identity and innate variations of sex characteristics, they are unable to define sex. In fact, there's a whole section of their executive summary, which is the only thing I've got into so far, because the document is nearly 500 pages long, twice as long as the original, which we thought was long enough. And so one of the reasons why they think that sex can't really be defined is because you can't rely on any legal document anymore. Well, wonder why that is.
Mm-hmm.
Your birth certificate doesn't actually, is no longer a reliable source of your sex assigned at birth. So that all the way through, they use sex assigned at birth, even though we all know as mothers that nowadays, from at least 20 weeks, you could have scans that show whether the baby has male genitalia, which would indicate it's probably going to be a boy. And actually, you could do blood tests that if there's a Y chromosome in the mum's blood, that's a baby boy. So it's not assigned at birth, and all the midwives do not suddenly have a quota. Oh, we must make this one a boy and that one a girl. It's just such bullshit, and it's all the way through the document. Plus, they talk about cisgender, which I always thought was a bit hilarious once I found out what cis was. So what they're doing is they reject binary sex, but they have created a new binary. Women can be either cis, i.e. identify that the fact that they are women, or they could be trans, in which case they're men. And so they created this new binary and made us a subset of ourselves as women. And the funny thing is, not funny, where they mention biological sex, it's in quote marks, but all the way through the document, gender identity and innate variations of sex character, none of that's in quote marks. That's normal, that's acceptable, that's definable. Sex is not.
So this is a 500-page document you've just said. I'm assuming the Law Commission didn't create this document in a vacuum. So who consulted with the Law Commission, do you know, on this? And were you or anybody who works in the sex rights area, were you asked to submit on this document?
Yes, there were 74 organisations that submitted, but they also had an expert group headed by people who are very much identified as trans allies or activists. But they had asked Speak Up for Women, and they took along FOWL, which is an older women's lobby group of academics, highly recommended academics, and Resist Gender Education was there. And then we also had, we requested and had a face-to-face, plus we did a written submission, and that was with Mana Wahine Kororo as well. And so, yeah, so our voices were there, but they're being ignored, and it's just, I mean, it's almost laughable because it says, oh, you know, there are some submitters that are really concerned about having their private parts, you know, handled by somebody who's not of their sex. And this is changing, though. You know, it's in a state of transition. So people aren't so worried about nudity anymore. And if you happen to be an elderly woman or a disabled person, and you would really like to have somebody who comes and washes your private parts, then that's not really the main concern, because actually the comfort of the client is not that important. It actually says that. And employers, so like, you know, an employer of people who provide those kind of personal cares, it's up to them to work it out. It's incredible. And in terms of, you know, public facilities, it says it's okay. I know that some women don't really like to get undressed in front of people who are not of the same sex assigned at birth as they are, but there's always options for these women. They could go into the toilet stall and get changed in the toilet stall, which if you've ever done that, you know, you have to put the seat down, then you have to put your clothes on the toilet seat, which you can't guarantee is clean, and then you're in this tight little confined space that you have to try and jiggle yourself in and out of your swimming costume. I mean, the whole thing is just so
it's almost like these indignities have taken us back 40, 50, 60 years, isn't it? So then language, you mentioned language before, and the use of language within the document. I mean, whoever controls the language controls the narrative, controls the culture.
Yeah.
From what you've seen, is there a very, and in law especially, I mean, law is about the semantics of statute and language. How dangerous is this, that if these recommendations are adopted, that this language is introduced into our legislation for women as a whole?
It actually has a section on gendered language in the Human Rights Act. They want to get rid of all the gendered provisions that talk about him, her, you know, and change them and replace them with gender neutral language. And I probably talked to you about this before, because when we did the midwives negotiations the last time, I was involved in that as a union advocate. They wanted to go through and remove all the pronouns that were sexed. And so what I did, I made the nouns plural so that they then did follow. But I don't know if that's changed, because it's very confusing. And so they want to clarify, they want to take all those out. But the worst bit is the first prohibited ground of discrimination is sex, including pregnancy and childbirth. So they want to change that, of course. And I'll just read. We recommend that this section should be amended to clarify that it applies to anyone who's pregnant or gives birth. The reform would be consistent with the rationale underlying Section 74, which is to allow preferential treatment that's needed because a person is pregnant or giving birth. Although most people who become pregnant and give birth are women, not all are. Needs associated with pregnancy or childbirth exist regardless of whether the person who is pregnant identifies as a woman. So I was reading from the executive summary. And it takes me back from when I first got involved in this issue. There was an article in the Sunday Star Times at the time that said exactly that. The headline was, not all women, not all people who are pregnant are women, not all mothers are women, or something like that. And I took exception to it. And there you go. They want to put it into the law.
Do you believe, Jill, that this is the slippery slope? They often talk in legal terms, having spent some time in a courtroom, they like to talk about a slippery slope. Is this
Oh,
the slippery slope that we're now experiencing after the changes to self-identification on birth certificates that came into legislation in what was
yes.
that, June
Yes.
23?
So that is what I was going to get to. So they claim that gender identity is well ingrained in New Zealand law and international law. They seem to have completely missed the Supreme Court decision of the UK. That's not mentioned at all. But, you know, you think about it, these are these acts that are relevant to women. So the Employment Relations Act doesn't have gender identity. The Equal Pay Act doesn't have gender identity. It's all about sex-based discrimination. The Human Rights Act right now does not have gender identity. The Bill of Rights Act refers to the Human Rights Act for the prohibited grounds of discrimination. No, it does not have gender identity. I checked the Education Training Act because of the issue around single-sex schools, and while it does refer to gender, you can record a person's gender. It doesn't have gender identity either. So, and that, you know, it is a slippery slope because the only two pieces of legislation is that births, deaths and marriages, self-sex ID and conversion practices. So they're both recent. And they've slipped in gender identity, and now they're saying, oh, we'll have to put it into the Human Rights Act because it's embedded is the word they use, in our legislation. And at the same time, internationally, they are defining sex. In fact, the Supreme Court of the UK was able to define sex. And the funny thing is, again, not funny, in the Human Rights Act, there is only one place where men and women are mentioned, and that's in relation to skills, where you are allowed to discriminate on the basis of mainly physical characteristics that either a man or a woman might have, that an employer can discriminate and say, I want to have a man for this job or I want to have a woman for this job. So in terms of the gender neutral language, of course, they're going to get rid of the only place that they actually define sex in the Human Rights Act right now.
The times that we live in, Jill. Now, in your press release, you concluded it with, it will be interesting to see how New Zealand First reacts to the recommendations, given its pre-election promise to defend women's spaces and women's sports. Winston spoke about both of those things at the conference that he held in Palmerston North on the weekend. Have you spoken with anyone inside New Zealand First about this proposal from the Law Commission?
No, I haven't personally, but there are people within the Women's Rights Party and also Manawahine Korero who do have close links with New Zealand First. And so I have encouraged them to go and talk to Winston in the first instance. But I do plan to go and talk to Casey Costello because she's in my area about this, because what we need to do is stop it getting to Parliament, because they don't have to put it in as a law. It's only the report's been tabled, but it doesn't have to be drafted as a bill and put through, because if it does get put through Parliament, it will win hands down, because even people, well, ACT will support it, probably most National Party MPs will support it, and obviously all of that Labour, Greens, Te Pāti Māori will support it because they're all full of it. On the sports thing, it says we should leave it up to sporting bodies, basically, because, but they do say, you know, it's terrible because transgender people everybody needs to be able to participate in sport. Yeah, but not everybody needs to participate in women's sports. That's for women. And, you know, they seem to ignore the fact that people who men who identify as women are actually men. And there is one place in here that about single-sex spaces that I just would love to read to you if you've got time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So first of all, they say we anticipate that under a law that permitted service providers to restrict access to single-sex facilities based on a person's sex assigned at birth, all people with non-conforming gender presentation would find themselves confronted more often when using public facilities. What do they mean? We already have a piece in the Human Rights Act that allows facilities managers and organisations to exclude and restrict access to single-sex facilities. But anyway, it goes on to say in the next bit, the primary concern raised with us by submitters who opposed a reform of this kind was that it would exacerbate safety risks for cisgender women and girls. Our research confirms that women are more likely to experience sexual violence than men, that sexual violence is usually perpetrated by men, and that many women have significant fear of sexual violence. However, we have not found evidence to support the concern that clarifying the legal entitlement of people who are transgender to use a single-sex facility that aligns with their gender identity exacerbates safety risks for cisgender women and girls. Well, the fact is, trans women are men. That's why it has to have the trans part in it. And these are most men don't want to go into the women's facilities. Most men are good men who respect the boundaries of women. But the men who want to go into women's facilities, those are exactly the men we don't want in there. Mm. So there's just so much in here. But the thing about single-sex schools is that they're relying on a provision in the Education Training Act that allows for single-sex schools, state schools, by the way, to have some, like boys' schools could have some girls, and girls' schools could have some boys, but it can't be so many of them that it will change the nature of that school. And it actually doesn't even talk about integrated schools, which is most of your Catholic schools or Anglican schools, and it doesn't talk about charter schools either, all of which would be covered by this change, which would require them to accept transgender children. And that's on the basis that, oh my gosh, if you don't, they won't have educational opportunities like everyone else. But everyone else has the opportunity to go to co-ed schools. No one's stopping them going to co-ed schools.
Well, and also the whole thing, because I mean, I'm a product of the single-sex school system, just going to a standard old Gisborne Girls High School. But then in my senior years, subjects weren't offered that I took. So I literally had to walk across the road to the boys' school to attend, but I was still very much, I was there as a young woman. There weren't a lot of us, but there was a cross-pollination between the schools. My sons are in the Catholic school system. I mean, why we're seeing the prevalence now. I mean, most of these kids that are identifying, and I think both you and I can quite strongly say that when the kids are concerned, particularly the young women, this is a social contagion.
Yes, that's right, and that's where the section of the Education Training Act comes in, because that's what it was set up to do, to allow for that. But there are many. I was a product of co-education because Mum believed in co-education. But funnily enough, when my little brother went to go to high school, she put him in Mount Albert Boys Grammar, which at that stage was a boys' school. But anyway, for my sister and I, we did very well out of the co-education system. But internationally, I'm finding when I go on these international calls I do every Wednesday morning that many, many people believe in single-sex education for girls, and that's much better for girls than co-education. So, and it's really about parental choice, isn't it?
And finding the right fit for your child as well. Every child is different, and it's finding the right fit and having those options and being able to preserve those options for our children and for parents, I think, is so important. And to blur those lines. They love blurring lines, Jill, don't they?
Yeah, well, funny enough, they specifically say that a religious school can exclude somebody on the grounds of their religion. So the Islamic schools, the Catholic schools, the Anglican schools, they could exclude people who are not of that religion. And so they're not going to touch that. But religion is a belief system. Gender ideology, they're very clear in this report, is not a belief or ideology. It's a feeling and an expression of your life. You know, it's what you experience. That's not a belief or ideology. But they're unable to say that sex is what sex is. And you know, I don't believe what they're saying at all. Obviously, most people wouldn't. I can't see what their logic is. Being trans is not immutable. Might be a deeply held experience, but there's enough detransitioners to show, and as you said about the social contagion, there is enough detransitioning going on to show that it's not immutable, whereas we can't change our sex.
No.
And
Well, it's a belief. It's a belief system as opposed to yeah. So I want to pivot now because the big news, obviously, in the space internationally, just that has broken in the last week or so, has been Graham Linehan's arrest in the UK over his tweets. Now, this is a massive free speech issue as well as his work in the sex positive movement. How can you see that incident relating to New Zealand's current discussions on the law? Or is it like everything else that's happening here, they just turn a blind eye to what is happening half a world away?
There are huge free speech issues in this change that they're promoting in the Human Rights Act. And although they deny it, they were specifically told they weren't to go to the issue of hate speech. But it's going to allow for that, I'm pretty sure. I'm about to go overseas myself. I'm going to be going to the UK. And so I hope that the authorities don't see this interview because it's probably really bad to say that trans women are men. But anyway, it was so much overreach by the Met to send 5 armed people to pick up Graham Linehan at the airport based on, it looks like, one person's complaint. But it's happening here all the time. It's just, it's happening to Yvonne van Dongen. You interviewed her.
I did.
Journalist. It's happening to counsellors. They keep being pulled up before their professional bodies. Most midwives they might roll their eyes at the end of the shift as they talk to each other, but they definitely can't say anything. In fact, I saw something where it said that the government was going to prevent all health professionals and education professionals from speaking out based on their ideology. So there are, it's just. Yeah.
And that's a natural step, to be honest, Jill. I mean, they've done it in other areas, and I have no, and in fact, already in medicine, and I mean, you've seen it with the midwives with the work that you've done there, but it's also appearing, because having a toe in the medical space, you're seeing it now. I mean, it is the self-censorship now by anybody in the medical profession if you don't toe the line, and the threat over your ability to work for holding opinions is now becoming quite pernicious amongst our professional bodies. And I know, as with your union hat on, do you see, is there support in that movement to actually protect workers against this sort of overreach and self-censorship in professional bodies?
No, unfortunately. I do keep encouraging people who get into trouble at work for their opinions to go to their union in the first place and just basically test to see if they're going to get the support, and then we could challenge it if they don't. But recently I was at the CTU, the Council of Trade Unions, or I wasn't there, but I heard about it from somebody who was there. At the National Affiliates Council meeting, where they tabled the new proposal to revise Sonia Davies' Working Women's Charter that goes back to the 1970s, most of which has not been achieved for working women. But now it's non-negotiable that they will include transgender people and non-binary folks, as they put it, in the Working Women's Charter. And when somebody who told me about this, who was at the meeting, questioned the non-negotiable part of that, he was told there is to be no debate and that's final. And there was a round of applause from all our union leaders across the country. So that's hugely disappointing because it's all parts of employment, particularly in the public sector, where there are these transgender employee guidelines that have been written up, which says things like employees could use depending on the agenda they identify with, which of course those other cases happening in Britain right now, the Sandy Peggy case and other cases around that issue too. And they have not had support from their unions. So that's really disappointing.
Yeah, very. So then let's get on to Helen's visit. So you guys are bringing Helen out to New Zealand. I can't wait. I'm so excited. So the Women's Right Party is bringing her out in October to talk about gender identity. So if our interest is, if we've got listeners now that are thinking, wow, Helen's coming, tell us a little bit more about the tour and how people can find out more and get involved.
Yes, so Helen arrives in New Zealand on the 24th of October, and the first event is an all-day seminar in Auckland, and there's going to be a panel discussion in the morning with very high-flying people around women's health priorities and how those have been captured. And then Helen will speak, and in the afternoon we're having a media workshop where Helen's going to lead it, talking about aspects like our messaging and how we can handle difficult interviews, and of course this whole issue of changing the Human Rights Act. We will be really trying to focus on that so that we can have a very effective campaign to try and stop it going through Parliament. So then we're going to have a bit of a chill for the Sunday. It's Labour weekend. And on the Monday, which is Labour Day, the 27th, we fly down to Christchurch. And Helen's going to be doing an evening meeting that night, 6 o'clock. And there'll be an option of having dinner with Helen at the venue. You'll note I haven't mentioned the names of the venues because we're not making that public because we don't want the disruptors to come along and try and close us down as they did with Sal Grover's event. Then we're going down to Dunedin, and she's going to do an evening meeting there on the 29th. And then on the 30th, we fly up to Wellington, where she's going to do an evening event. And the next day, a media workshop where the Wellington people are really wanting to focus on strategising around a campaign to stop this, the changes, particularly in the area of the exceptions in the Human Rights Act that were carved out to protect women and girls' rights. So then she comes back up to Auckland where she's going to meet up with the Free Speech Union, and then they're going to tour her because she's going to appear at AGMs for the Free Speech Union in Auckland and Christchurch. So it's very tricky to get hold of tickets. I've got links to the tickets, and that will enable us to capture people's emails and tell them the venue. The difficulty is if we put those links out, the people who want to organise to disrupt could potentially find out the venue. So I suggest that your listeners private message me on Facebook, or that they write to me, secretary at, and it's one word, Women's Rights Party, .nz, and I can and if they tell me that they're an RCR listener, then I'll know that it's unlikely that any of the disruptors are probably well, they might, but anyway.
Well, it's insane, isn't it, to think in this current environment that these are the measures and links that we have to go to in order to protect free speech and the freedom of expression. It just astounds me that you would have thought that we have to do this, but this is, this, here we are, isn't it? And it hasn't, looking back to March 23 to now, so, and I'm talking about Albert Park.
Yeah.
Are things better, worse, or the same?
They're potentially a bit better. I think I think the police have got the message that they need to be more active in defending people's right to speak. They seem to have not realised that at Albert Park, or, you know, ridiculous anyway. But we had an event in St Patrick's Square sometime later September that year that the police turned out in force, and there was only a small group of protesters and they were held at bay. So I think so. But last year when we toured Sal Grover, we brought her over here for the same reason that we want to have Helen Joyce here, is to highlight why we don't want to allow this to creep in and override women's rights. We had to have alternative venues at places, and then we had to tell people at the last minute because they were turning up to disrupt at Rutherford House at Victoria University, for example. And then they do hunt us down. I've been at several protests in Wellington in particular where they hunt us down. They follow us around, they try and find where we are, and they just scream in our ears with megaphones. And we had a protest outside the Department of Corrections about men and women's prisons, and there they turned up. And I tried to engage, but the woman with the loud hailer just kept screaming at me that I knew nothing about women's prisons and none of us had ever been near them. But in actual fact, midwives go into women's prisons because sometimes women prisoners are pregnant when they're in there. And also I know lawyers who do parole work with women's prisoners and all sorts. So it's not like, I personally have never been in a women's prison, but there are plenty of people who have. And but the point is they won't engage. They just scream in your ear with a loud hailer. So.
And finally, with your women's rights hats on now, and I mean the election is next year, how are you going to engage with voters? But also, too, you have a very strong voice to be able to talk to other political parties that are under the tent. New Zealand First is a very sympathetic ear in this area. You mentioned before ACT and National. Why do you think ACT and National have dug their toes in so much over this issue when it is a belief system and it is something that is so strongly held by voters on the other side of the aisle? I wouldn't have thought that this would be a strong issue with those that would traditionally vote National and ACT. So why are they so wedded to the idea of gender ideology?
So they play it down. It's not an issue, of course. It does fit with the libertarian views of ACT to allow for people with gender identity and etc. to have rights under the Human Rights Act. That fits with their ideology. But National will just play it down. Oh, it's nothing to see here, which is what Christopher Luxon did before the election. Our view is, I know that a lot of our supporters do actually end up going into the polling booth and voting for New Zealand First on the basis of these issues. But the thing is that if they don't vote for the Women's Rights Party, no one knows that that is the issue that's important to women. If they vote for New Zealand First, it could be because they're very interested in the treaty issues or they're very interested in some of the other issues that New Zealand First raises. You don't know on what basis they actually did vote for New Zealand First. And of course, Winston is a very strong populist character, and he will raise issues that he knows will get the support. And women are a huge voting base, particularly older women. So I do think that people do need to vote for the Women's Rights Party on the list so that we get a decent number of people, so that it shows that there is concern about this. We probably will we probably will stand a list and not contest electorate seats because there's no need for us to do that. Because we're not going to put our energy into trying to win a seat. But yeah, so, we can encourage people to vote for particular candidates that support our cause. And there may be some of those candidates within the other parties. It's possible that that there are some MPs within Labour, for example, maybe even not the Greens, but that would support this. Although I think they're pretty much whipped on this issue. I did note I get the headlines for The Economist, and I'm not allowed any more free reading. But yesterday there was an article that the Democrats have realised in the USA that they need to focus less on pronouns and more on policies that will get, working people's votes. So maybe one lives in hope that Labor will one day get that message, but it's certainly not there right now.
Because you mentioned the libertarian aspect before with the ACT Party. I mean, the thing is that if it's a belief system from a libertarian perspective, because I consider myself a libertarian, from a libertarian perspective, I have no issue how someone chooses to lead their life. I don't need to be part of their belief that they hold. So therefore, so by imposing these things in law, which is what the Law Commission is recommending, by changing long-held statutes and laws and legislation, you are then imposing a belief on a person. So I would have thought the ACT Party would be all over that.
Yes, they haven't said, have they? So I don't know. I'm just surmising. I think it would be that everyone could live their life, but the problem is there are reasons why there are 19 sex exceptions in the Human Rights Act, because an elderly woman who's getting showered by somebody who is actually a man, when she asked the agency to only send women, she does have rights, surely, that overpower any rights that this man has to express his gender identity and go into a house. And just.
And these are the practical things that we're talking about, isn't it? Look, it's been a joy, of course, to catch up with you, Jill. I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the events with Helen Joyce, and we will have that email address for Jill in the show notes. So if you are a listener and you would like to engage and see if pop along to one of the events, so you can email Jill and make contact. Look, thank you so much for your time today. We really do appreciate you talking to us here at RCR. And remember, if you've got a comment about this interview, 2057 is the text, or inbox at rcr.media. Hey, thanks, Jill, for your time today.